Hello there. For many of you in this particular audience, Gordon hardly needs an introduction. For years, he has had a special niche within IPPNWC circles as its sole scientific advisor. Gordon obtained degrees from 3 universities, Toronto, Chicago, and finally a PhD in mathematics from Queen's University. He is now a retired teacher of maths and sciences at Vanier College in Montreal. He was the co-founder of Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, or CCNR, which was incorporated federally as a not-for-profit in 1978. This dates CCNR as 4 years older than our parent organization. CCNR is dedicated to education and research on all issues related to nuclear energy, whether civilian or military, including non-nuclear alternatives. CCNR website has become a key reference for in-depth analysis of virtually any nuclear issue. From Gordon's high school days, where he was told, as many of us in this audience were told, that nuclear energy was clean, cheap, safe, and abundant, to his uncovering of what he now calls nuclear industry's lies, he has become valued as a consultant on nuclear issues, including being qualified as a nuclear expert in Canadian and foreign courts. Although you may have heard him talk on various radio and TV shows or on David Suzuki's Nature of Things, this evening, we are indeed fortunate to have him join us here live. Gordon has offered to answer questions. Should your question remain unanswered, he will answer via email. We are indeed favored that Gordon is IPPNWC's scientific advisor. Over to you, Gordon.
I'm just going to share my screen so that I can give my talk, which is not at all the last word in the subject. Nothing could be the last word in the subject and nothing is more uncertain than the future. But I'd like to share some points of view with you and some information that I hope will help us to come to grips with the question of where Canada is going in its promotion of nuclear power as a key ingredient in combating climate change. So the title of my talk, rather puckishly, is Don't Nuke the Climate. And obviously there's a point of view. This is not a completely balanced perspective. It's going to be very much a single point of view. Why nuclear is not really the way to fight climate change. Now, as we all know, nuclear fission was discovered in Berlin in around Christmas time of 1938. And it is the key to all nuclear fission technology. Both nuclear bombs, nuclear reactors, there wouldn't be any nuclear weapons of any description were it not for uranium to begin with. Other atoms can be split, but only uranium can be harnessed through the mechanism of a chain reaction. Now, in 1943 in Quebec, our Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, met with President Roosevelt of the United States and Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, for a tripartite agreement to cooperate in building the world's first atomic bombs. And the reason why Canada was essential for this is because we had ready access to the uranium through the historical accident, Port Hope, Ontario, which had been processing radium. And wherever there's radium, there's going to be uranium as well. This led to 2 atomic bombs, Little Boy, made from uranium-235, which was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, and Fat Man, which was made of plutonium-239. Now, I said that uranium is the only naturally occurring material from which you can make an atomic bomb. That's correct. Plutonium is not found in nature in any quantity, and consequently, it is produced as a derivative of uranium. It's a uranium derivative which is created inside nuclear reactors. In fact, the first nuclear reactors were built for the sole purpose of producing plutonium for bombs. And that goes with the first reactors in Canada as well. And every reactor operating in the world today, fueled with uranium, automatically produces plutonium as a byproduct. All plutonium is weapons usable. Plutonium is a more powerful nuclear explosive than uranium-235. Now, Oppenheimer in 1945, when the Nagasaki bomb, the precursor of it, the Trinity test, quoted Krishna, an avatar of Vishnu, the god Vishnu, saying, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And above, we see a picture here of 24 avatars or incarnations of the Hindu god Vishnu. The reason I like this picture is because it reminds me that uranium itself has many incarnations or avatars, that it manifests itself in many, many different ways in the world. Shapeshifting is the ability to physically transform oneself through an inherently superhuman ability, and this is what uranium does. Uranium atoms undergo 3 shape-shifting transformations. I call them metamorphosis, fragmentation, and impregnation. Metamorphosis is the natural process of radioactive disintegration, which produces about 24 radioactive decay products in the earth, so that whenever you mine uranium, you bring to the surface not only the uranium, but all of those decay products as well, which are left behind in the wastes. And consequently, we have large legacy of long-lived radioactive waste from uranium mining. The fragmentation refers to the nuclear reactor where the uranium atoms are split, creating hundreds of new radioactive elements, whose nuclei are the broken pieces of uranium atoms. And finally, impregnation. Some forms of uranium become heavier when they absorb a neutron without splitting, and this produces plutonium and americium and curium and the so-called transuranic elements. So there are literally hundreds, even perhaps as many as 1,000 avatars of uranium. All of these materials, every single one of them, began life as a uranium atom. Now, the decay products create 220 million tons of uranium mill waste in Canada, containing all those decay products, and they have an effective half-life of 76,000 years. And basically, these wastes are right now left on the surface, and they will constitute a very long-term threat to the ecology and to human beings. Fission products are created, have already created 5 to 6 million irradiated fuel bundles in Canada. There's only about 4 million now, but they're adding more all the time. And plutonium, which is already stored in every country that has nuclear reactors, creates an opportunity for nuclear weapons use for many thousands of years to come, because plutonium itself has a half-life of 24,000 years. So any regime thousands of years from now can recuperate that plutonium and use it to make bombs, nuclear weapons. As we know, radioactive disintegration is a spontaneous process that cannot be controlled. We don't know how to speed it up or slow it down or shut it off. And this is why we have a radioactive waste problem, because we can't shut it off. And when the atom disintegrates, it gives off a kind of subatomic shrapnel, which is called atomic radiation. And this is what makes it dangerous to living things. A nuclear chain reaction is what creates the fission products. When the atom is split, energy is released, and the results are these broken pieces called fission products. And all the things that you hear about in a nuclear accident, like cesium-137, strontium-90, and so on, these are really broken pieces of uranium atoms. They too started off as uranium atoms. This glass ball is exactly the same size as the ball of plutonium in the bomb that destroyed the city of Nagasaki. It's only about 6 kilograms, and it's about the size of a small grapefruit. So there's a tremendous power. This is enough to destroy an entire city. It's quite astonishing when you think of the power of this material and the danger that it poses to humanity. Even the so-called H-bombs, which are based on fusion, require a plutonium trigger. And without that plutonium trigger, the H-bombs are helpless, they're harmless. In fact, when they dismantle the H-bombs, what they do is they just take the plutonium out of it, and it's no longer a nuclear weapon. One of the big problems is how to go from the nuclear reactor, which produces the plutonium, to the nuclear weapon, which uses the plutonium. Fortunately, it's not easy to do this because there's something which I call a radioactive firewall. The spent fuel, the used fuel bundles are so radioactive that they would kill any human being that tries to come in contact with them unshielded. The result is that it's by no means easy to go from the reactor to the bomb, and that firewall is what protects the fact that not everybody with nuclear reactors can readily make nuclear weapons. However, there is a process called reprocessing, and that is precisely a robotic technique for chemically extracting the plutonium from the used nuclear fuel, which is generally about 1% or half of 1% in the case of Canadian reactors. Once that plutonium has been separated out, it can either be reused to fuel more reactors, and consequently it has a civilian interest. And the civilian nuclear scientists are very interested in the idea of recuperating the plutonium and extending the fuel supply for nuclear reactors in the future. However, once the plutonium has been extracted, it can just as easily be used in bombs because plutonium itself is not that radioactive in terms of external radiation, so that it can be, in fact, smuggled across borders. It can be transported much more easily than an intense gamma emitting material, which it is not. I'd like to, at this point, just insert a commercial. There's going to be a webinar on plutonium reprocessing in Canada, scheduled for the week of January the 18th, 2023, and you're all invited to attend. You'll be getting more information if you notify me through my email address. It is part of a campaign to have the government of Canada ban plutonium extraction in Canada, which seems to be becoming more and more likely, and as already steps have been taken, money has been spent in that direction already. This event will be co-sponsored by your organization, IPPNWC. Now, President Jimmy Carter in 1977, he was president from 77 to 81. He banned plutonium reprocessing in the USA and tried to get it banned worldwide precisely because of this danger, which relates directly to the founding mission of IPPNW, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Preventing nuclear war begins with preventing access to the materials that can be used to make these nuclear weapons. And that includes highly enriched uranium and plutonium. And Jimmy Carter, who was the only head of state in the United States that was actually trained as a nuclear engineer in the nuclear Navy, he banned plutonium reprocessing because he was well aware of what it involved. He also created, however, a solar energy research institute to explore the role of solar energy in meeting America's energy needs. This led to a publication of a book called A New Prosperity by the Solar Energy Research Institute that Carter founded. This was in 1981, and it's a very interesting book, 450 pages, and with a lot of data in it. And it talks about how we can create a stable foundation for growth in the United States, where the pillars of this new prosperity are energy efficiency and renewable energy. And this was the first time that very detailed authoritative work had been done on just what is possible. And one of the interesting things about this book is that they say that solar energy, it's fairly easy for solar energy to play a major role, but the key thing is energy efficiency. That if you have an energy efficient society, then the renewables really make sense. If you have an energy wasteful society, the renewables, a lot of it is just going out the window. You're just losing that energy instead of using it. Now, this was echoed in Canada by the Cogger report of 1993 by the Royal Society of Canada. Cogger stands for Canadian Options for Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction. And the Cogger report was a little prescient in this regard as well. I'm just quoting here, it appears to be feasible and cost effective to achieve Canada's interim target of stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions at 1990 levels by the year 2000, and to achieve an absolute reduction of about 20% by 2010. Wouldn't it be nice if we had followed their advice and actually put in place the policies that they were recommending back in 1993? That's almost 30 years ago. And one of the tragedies of the climate crisis is that we have postponed and postponed and postponed and put off acting on it to the point where we now have already almost lost it. And now we're desperately trying to sort of do what we should have done a long time ago. The warnings were there much earlier, and we just didn't pay attention. But again, they like the Siri report, they recognize that improved energy efficiency is the key. And in fact, the major reductions that you can get are through energy efficiency, and that can be done quickly. And it also creates an awful lot of jobs, far more jobs than any energy supply. And of course, it's beneficial to all those involved, both the workers who do it and the people who benefit from the reduced energy bills. And that makes them more financially self-sufficient as well as energy self-sufficient. This economic potential will not come about by itself. Government policy will be required to make it happen. And of course, as we know, those government policies were not forthcoming. They also said on the supply side, most studies predict a significant penetration of renewable energy in the electricity generation and transportation sectors. For electricity production, the generating mix switches away from coal, oil, and nuclear. They had no role for nuclear in this Cargo report. They were talking about efficiency, renewables, and to some extent, fuel switching from one fuel to another in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on the basis of the characteristics of those fuels. Now, this is a report from 2008, so we're beginning to get close to where we are today. And it's from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And you notice that even then in 2008, nuclear energy only represented about 2% of global energy. That's on the left of this pie diagram. And on the right, we have renewables, which represented 12.9%, which is substantially more. And the shares of energy sources in total global primary energy supply in 2008 certainly shows that the system is dominated by fossil fuels. But by 2011, IPCC, the same organization, pointed out that the technical potential of renewable energy technologies to supply energy services exceeds current demands. So there was never any question that renewable energy, at least by the mathematical measurements of how much energy they can produce, is more than enough to meet all of our global energy needs. That has not been really a serious question. The question is more about modalities. Can you have enough energy storage in order to take you over the rough spots when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing, et cetera, et cetera? Do you really need to depend upon so-called baseload electricity and so on? So arguments come about not because of the overall capacity of renewable energy to meet all of our energy needs, but the desirability politically and technically and financially, I suppose, of getting there. Now, if we go up to 2022, we come to our own government, which has cast its lot in the nuclear field, it seems, to a large degree. This is November 3rd, 2022. The Government of Canada, a fiscal update, introduced an investment credit of up to 30% for clean energy technologies, including small modular reactors. The government has also indicated it will consult on additional technologies, including large-scale nuclear. This inclusion of nuclear in the tax credit sends a clear signal that the Canadian government considers nuclear power to be quote unquote clean energy. Now, I defy anybody listening to go to any dictionary and look up the definition of clean and see if you can find any meaning of the word clean that would apply to nuclear. I have been unable to do so. The closest I was able to come is that clean means non-polluting. That's not true of nuclear. It also means, for example, not radioactive. Well, that's not true of nuclear either. If anybody can come up with a dictionary definition of clean that would actually apply to nuclear energy, I'd be very happy to see it. So this is why the word lie might be a little bit strong medicine, But I do think that this is a lie, calling it clean energy. Okay, you can say that it's non-carbon emitting. You can, there's a lot of things you can say which are true. To call it clean is simply not true. And of course, Canadian taxpayer money is now going into the nuclear industry. 2 plutonium-based reactors in New Brunswick, one of which requires plutonium at the outset, the other of which is a breeder reactor, which doesn't require it immediately, but which intends to reprocess that spent fuel to get the plutonium for reuse. That's the so-called ARC liquid sodium reactor. And there's 1 to 4 American-based reactors. For the Darlington site, the government of Canada has given a loan to OPG, Ontario Power Generation, of almost $1 billion, as if they needed it. OPG is huge and has the backing of the whole province of Ontario, the provincial government, for its credit. So the government of Canada has clearly taken this path. And the assumption is that new nuclear power is needed to combat climate change. Renewables are not sufficient. Again, that's not true. Renewables are sufficient. They're just not there. But is nuclear energy agile enough to address the climate emergency? Let's consider the history of the nuclear industry worldwide and compare it with the renewable alternatives. One of the things that many people find surprising is that nuclear power has shown 25 years of arrested development. There has been no increase in nuclear reactors around the world in 25 years. In 1996, there were 438 reactors worldwide. In 2019, 442, 4 more reactors, a net increase of 4 reactors. And in 1996, however, those 438 reactors represented 17% of global electricity, whereas now it's only 10% of global electricity, less than 10, in fact. So the contribution of nuclear to world electricity supply is declining sharply and is expected to continue to decline. And by the way, electricity being only part of the energy pie, when you translate this into global energy instead of global electricity, it started off at about 3.3% of global energy, and now it's down to less than 2%. So we're talking about a technology that is not thriving and has not been thriving for a long time. It's been on the decline for quite a while. Back around the year 2000, 2001, there was a lot of talk about a nuclear renaissance. They said at that time that there were going to be maybe thousands of nuclear reactors built worldwide, certainly hundreds, large reactors that would be much better, much safer, much cleaner, and much faster to build, that would give a renaissance to the nuclear industry and would get out of the slump we're in. Because frankly, up until that time, there hadn't been any new reactors ordered in North America since 1977. It turns out that that nuclear renaissance was a fiasco. It was a complete failure. There were only a handful of reactors ordered, and they turned out to be rather terrible headaches. In Finland, there was the Olkiluoto reactor, which was supposed to start up in 4 years, and now it only started up this year. So from 2005 to 2022, that's 17 years of construction, basically, before from beginning of construction to startup. And the cost went way over by either 5.5 billion euros or 8 billion euros, depending on how you figure it. That's equivalent 8 billion euros. Now, $11 billion is the final cost. So when I say the $8 billion, that's over budget. The 11 billion euros is the total cost, and that's around 16 billion Canadian dollars. That's for one reactor. So this is incredibly expensive and also extremely slow. And by the way, it bankrupted the Areva company, technically, which is because it's owned by the French government, it can't really be bankrupted. So it was turned over to EDF, Electricité de France. Now in Georgia, the United States, around the same time, February 2012, this is, the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission approved the application to build and operate 2 new reactors in Georgia. Well, they haven't started up yet either. And they're the first new reactors to receive construction approval in more than 30 years. They were supposed to come online quickly. It's been already 10 years and there's no end in sight at the moment. The $14 billion price tag escalated to more than double. And also there's been an awful lot of losses. There were two similar reactors destined for South Carolina, and they were canceled, even though they had already sunk $9 billion into it, a $9 billion loss. There are also criminal charges in connection with that. So the main message here is that nuclear power is too costly and too slow. So as Greg Jericho in Australia said, it's zero use to Australia's emissions plan. It's just too costly and too slow. And here in Canada, we have over 100 groups who have signed a statement saying nuclear power is a dirty, dangerous distraction from really combating climate change as an emergency, which is what it is. It's an emergency and should be treated as such. Now, let's turn to the renewables for a moment. Here we have the annual growth of wind and solar capacity, 2000 to 2025. This is in that a 25-year period as well. It's just been going more and more rapidly upwards until the graph is almost vertical. It's just increasing so rapidly. And as a matter of fact, those dotted lines indicate previous projections. It's exceeding all previous projections. They have to keep revising the projections upwards because it's always doing better than they said it was going to do. The actual growth is shown in black. Various IEA, that's the International Energy Agency, forecasts are shown in red and shades of blue. Here, for example, we have a 2021 press release saying exceptional new normal, IEA, raises the growth forecast for wind and solar by another 25%. They point out in the second bullet point there that the renewable energy market update forecasts nearly 40% higher growth than expected a year ago. So renewables are doing astonishingly well, and the price is dropping like a stone. And it keeps going down. Now, it turns out that this year is the first year that the price of renewables has actually gone up. So the price of renewables in 2022 did increase from 2021, largely as a result of the same inflationary forces that we're all experiencing. But the other energy options went up much more. And so renewables are still maintaining the same advantage over the other sources. Basically, you could say that solar and wind are now the cheapest. This is a quote from the International Energy Agency. Solar and wind are now the cheapest bulk power sources in 91% of the world. And the United Nations IAEA expects renewables to generate 90% of all new power in the coming years. As Amory Levin said, the more urgent climate change is, the more we must be careful to invest judiciously, not indiscriminately, to buy cheap, fast, sure options instead of costly, slow, speculative ones. Anything else effectively worsens climate change. Here's another graph, which is rather hard to make out. I'm sure we don't want to look at too many graphs, but that green line at the diagonal line is the renewables. This is from the Energy Information Administration of the United States. And the bottom line, the red line, is nuclear. And you can just see how much faster and cheaper renewables are than nuclear. Here's from the World Economic Forum, taking not a North American look, but a world look. The red line indicates the renewable share, which now exceeds 80%. And the blue lines represent growths in renewables each year. And the gray lines represent growths in non-renewables, all non-renewables, including nuclear. So you can see what's happening there. It's pretty clear. Now, this is a little bit hard to make out also. I promise I won't have too many more of these. This is from 2022, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You notice the purple rectangle at the top there is wind and solar. And what this is showing is the potential energy production to 2030, estimated by IPCC. And you see the potential for nuclear is way smaller. It's just way smaller. It's 4 or 5 times smaller. You can just do the measurement yourself. And so it all comes down to this. And of course, we turn our attention momentarily to Germany. Germany is the one country in Europe, which has received most attention, although it's not the only one phasing out of nuclear power. It's got the most attention because it started off shutting down 8 reactors right away. And since then, it's said from the beginning that it would shut down all 17 of its reactors by 2022. And in fact, they only have 2 more operating, and they were going to shut them down this year. But because of the Ukrainian invasion, they're keeping them open for another year. And who knows, maybe another year after that. But they have been on target, unlike the construction of new nuclear. What's interesting about this is that there are a total of 26 nuclear reactors now being dismantled. 3 of them are already finished. They built 30,000 megawatts of wind that were installed in 8 years, whereas Canada's whole nuclear capacity is less than 15,000 megawatts. You couldn't possibly build 30,000 megawatts of nuclear in 8 years, I don't believe, certainly not in North America. There's no way. It gives you an idea again. You have to bear in mind that the wind capacity factor is probably only about a third of that, but even that is very substantial. So it just once again highlights the importance of being able to get these things quickly deployed. Germany more than doubled its offshore wind power capacity in the year 2014 alone. These are fast to build. And by the way, you don't need a lot of advanced scientists and technical people to put these things up. Unlike nuclear, one of the problems with nuclear is they don't have the personnel. They don't have enough trained personnel to build all the reactors they would want to build. A lot of people think that by shutting down the nuclear, Germany has surely worsened its carbon emissions. Not true. The carbon emissions from Germany have been going down for 30 years steadily. In the last year, it went up a little bit, but sector by sector, it's been going down. And it's not true that they have increased their reliance on coal nor on Russia, and it is not increasing blackouts. So these are myths that are often spouted about Germany, but it's simply not the case. Now, even China. Now, China would be one of the best, you might say, poster children for nuclear, because everybody says, well, they're building a lot of nuclear. Well, let's take a look. At the end of 2020, China had a nuclear power generation capacity of 49.6 gigawatts from 50 reactors. Well, that's a lot, 50 reactors, with an additional 17 gigawatts under construction of nuclear. But at the end of 2020, China had already installed 281 gigawatts of wind and 253 gigawatts of solar, making a total of 534 gigawatts of non-hydro renewables, which simply dwarfs the nuclear contribution completely. To meet its 2030 goals, China plans to more than double its wind and solar power generation capacity. That would take you up to over 1,000 gigawatts in the coming decade. So existing renewable capacity is already over 10 times the nuclear capacity. And by 2030, its capacity will likely be more than 16 times its nuclear capacity. Again, these are pretty dramatic figures for a country that many people hold up as an example of why we need nuclear. If we go to Wall Street, Lazard pointed out in 2021, the cost of electricity from new nuclear plants will be between 131 and 204 per megawatt hour, whereas newly constructed utility scale solar and wind plants produce electricity between $26 and $50 per megawatt hour. So nuclear costs have increased, but costs for solar and wind have declined rapidly, and this is expected to continue over the coming decades. Renewables are about 4 times cheaper than nuclear and about 4 times faster to deploy. They're also proven. There's no doubt that they work. Most new nuclear projects, both fission and fusion, have many dubious aspects. They are unproven and untested. They are slow to deploy. Sometimes they do not work at all. Think of the Maple reactors, if you know what they are. Energy efficiency is even cheaper and faster than renewables, because we've been talking about renewables, but energy efficiency is a lot faster and cheaper than either one of those. For example, converting from electric resistance heating to using heat pumps throughout Quebec would provide enough surplus electricity to run Quebec's entire transportation sector without building any additional power plants of any kind. An astonishing fact. That's an example of the power of energy efficiency. So given the climate crisis is indeed an emergency, we should be investing in what is fastest and cheapest to get immediate benefits. That means energy efficiency and renewables in that order. There's no way of knowing ahead of time just how successful this will all be in terms of getting to 100% replacement of fossil fuels, but it is certain that it will reduce the greenhouse gas emissions significantly, giving any other energy technology a much lesser job to do. Moreover, the payback time will be short. Capital invested in renewables and efficiency will be recovered through energy savings in a matter of a few years, in good time for further investments in more renewables or in anything else, a simple strategy based on common sense. However, investing in nuclear locks up capital for decades without providing any benefits at all until the reactors are finished and ready to go. And even then, it takes years for them to pay back the cost of building them. That represents decades of delay in which greenhouse gas emissions are increasing unabated. During this time, the climate crisis is getting worse. Even when capital is eventually paid back, much of it has to be earmarked for the expensive job of dealing with radioactive waste and the robotic dismantling of the radioactive structures. It is a technical and economic quagmire. Not only financial capital, but also political capital is essentially co-opted into the nuclear channel rather than what should be the first priority, reducing greenhouse gases quickly and permanently. All of this was a kind of a business case, but it wasn't looking at the externalities, which are the real things that bother me about nuclear. It's not just that it doesn't work fast enough or isn't cheap enough. It's that it produces radioactive waste. This is not addressed at all in the government's proposal for small modular reactors. Nuclear accidents, the effects are disregarded. It's not discussed. Aggressive attacks, for example, Zaporizhia in Ukraine, they want to sell these reactors, Canada does, around the world. They don't just want to build them here in Canada. They want to market them around the world. Imagine what kind of opportunity that exists. Wherever there's a war, you could have a nuclear disaster from the war. Weapons proliferation, of course, policing the world, lack of trained engineers and technical people, onset of a global plutonium economy, the democratic deficit, who decides and how. These are all externalities which I think are extremely serious. There's a warning from a nuclear physicist from long ago, 1976, Sir Brian Flowers. He said, the dangers of the creation of plutonium in large quantities in conditions of increasing world unrest are genuine and serious. We should not rely for energy supply on a process that produces such a hazardous substance as plutonium unless there is no reasonable alternative. Plutonium appears to offer unique potential for threat and blackmail against society because of its great radiotoxicity and its fissile properties. The unquantifiable effects of the security measures that might become necessary should be a major consideration. There should be no commitment to a large nuclear program until the issues have been fully appreciated and weighed in the light of wide public understanding. So I want to remind you again, the webinar on plutonium reprocessing in Canada is scheduled for the week of January 18th. You're all welcome, and thank you very much for your courtesy.